a part of what's going on during the transition process is Bush, with Cheney taking the lead, is choosing his administration. Bush had already made clear that he wanted Colin Powell to be his Secretary of State. Cheney and Powell had obviously served together, worked together closely during the first Bush presidency, the Gulf War in particular, but over the years their views of the world, their views of foreign policy had diverged. Cheney had become much more hardline in his thinking, Powell much more oriented to diplomacy. So given that Colin Powell was going to be Secretary of State in the Bush presidency, it was of vital importance to Cheney that Powell be surrounded and to some extent outnumbered by other foreign policy heavyweights who shared his own view of things, and in particular, the appointment of his mentor, Donald Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense. Indeed, Cheney was able during this transition process to plant allies throughout the administration, in OMB, in the Environmental Protection Agency, in the Interior Department, not just at the cabinet level, not even mostly at the cabinet level, but 2 and 3 rungs below the cabinet level. The Vice President was also part of a small group that throughout the Bush presidency reviewed candidates for federal judicial appointments to appraise their conservative credentials. In terms of the role that Cheney would play as Vice President, he brought a unique perspective to the office. He was the only Vice President who had worked in close proximity to a previous Vice President. When Cheney was Ford's Chief of Staff, the Vice President was Nelson Rockefeller, and Cheney had seen Rockefeller thwarted time and again, often by Cheney himself, in his clumsy efforts to take charge of domestic policy in the Ford administration. Cheney learned what it was like to outmaneuver a vice president who was sort of stepping forward prominently, pursuing his own brief, and Cheney understood from that is not how you become an influential vice president. What he did obtain from George W. Bush was an unprecedented mandate, granting him access to, as Cheney himself put it, every table and every meeting that took place throughout the administration. This freedom to be active in whatever area he wanted to be active. In forming his own staff, Cheney signaled where his main interest in public policy lay. He appointed longtime associate Scooter Libby as Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor to the Vice President, and he appointed David Addington as General Counsel. Both men had spent several years working with Cheney on foreign and defense matters when he was in Congress and in the Defense Department. Cheney also doubled from 6 to 12 the size of the Vice President's National Security Staff. And wise in the ways of the White House, he, at the front end, obtained for his leading assistants a place at the table when when presidential assistants gathered for their meetings. Cheney, from the start, met regularly, not just with the National Security Council, but also, again, uniquely for a vice president, with the NSC's Principals Committee, that is, the National Security Council when the president is not present. The president wasn't there very often, but Cheney was almost always there. Taking his cues from George W. Bush, however, Cheney's initial focus was on domestic policy. From the start, he played a vital role in making and promoting the administration's taxing and spending policies. He helped forge a compromise on Capitol Hill between the $1.6 trillion tax cut that Bush wanted and the $1.25 trillion tax cut that Congress initially was willing to give the president. Cheney brokered that compromise that brought it in at a little over $1.33 trillion. Cheney chaired an annual budget review so that anyone within the cabinet who was unhappy with the budget that the Office of Management and Budget had assigned his department for the coming year could go to Cheney and make that appeal. Theoretically, they could then go to President Bush if they didn't like what Cheney said, but they all knew that there was no point in going to President Bush if Cheney gave them an answer that they didn't want, because Bush would back him up entirely. In addition to taxing and spending, Cheney arranged for all legislation passed by Congress to pass through his office so that it could be vetted before it reached the president's desk. Cheney also worked hard to advance his pro-business, pro-development environmental policies throughout the executive branch, widely connected in Washington. Someone once pointed out that Cheney was one of the very few Republicans who love government, who don't think of Washington as populated by bureaucrats who just couldn't make it in the private sector if they had to. Cheney was somebody who loved the workings of government. Republicans tend not to love the workings of government, and therefore they don't stay long enough to figure out how things operate deep down in the bowels of the bureaucracy. Cheney has never talked pejoratively about bureaucrats. He loves government and was able, for that reason, to know when an issue of concern to say, a private corporation supportive of the Republican Party came to his attention and involved something going on deep down in the middle ranks or lower ranks of the Environmental Protection Agency, Cheney knew who to call and knew what to say to maximize the chances that the decision would go his way. There aren't many Republicans who care enough about the workings of the federal government to give themselves that kind of education. Now notice, everything I'm talking about involves a vice president who was enormously influential in the White House and throughout the executive branch, and to some extent in Congress, before 9/11. We think of Cheney as somebody who sort of came to life after 9/11 and then became more and more powerful as the Iraq War was being complemented. It's true to some extent, but understand from day one, Dick Cheney was working influentially within the administration across its full range of activities. Cheney's most prominent assignment before September 11th was to lead the task force on energy policy. Concerned that the task force's deliberations remained confidential, his counsel, David Addington, advised Cheney that the membership of this task force should consist entirely of government officials because that freed the task force from the requirements of the Federal Advisory Commission Act. So when Congress's investigative arm, the General Accounting Office, asked to review the task force's records, Cheney refused. Now, why did Cheney refuse any sort of access to the Energy Task Force's operations, even a list of people who were involved in offering their testimony before it? It's not that there was any surprise when this task force came out with pro-oil drilling recommendations. There was nothing about that should have surprised anybody. We almost have to look back to Cheney's years in the White House to understand why he wanted to lay down such a strong marker to Congress about the integrity, the institutional insulation of the White House from Congress.